so I think we should probably start. My first guest today is somebody who has had a lot of different hats. He is the former governor of Massachusetts. He is the former CEO of Harvard Pilgrim, a giant health insurer. He was briefly an executive in residence with General Catalyst, the venture capital firm, but right now, and mostly what we'll be talking about, he is president of the NCAA. Please welcome Charlie Baker. So, Charlie, there was a Boston Magazine profile of you very recently, and it was kind of talking about a speech you gave at a school. You talked about how you'd wanted to be a sports writer when you were a teenager, and you made a comment, I finally got into sports 47 years later. But then there was a little bit of a kicker from Boston Magazine. It said you've, quote, taken on what might be the worst job in all of American athletics. Why did you take this job?
A lot of people told me when I was first approached about this job that I was, in fact, one of the worst jobs in sports. However, I played basketball in college. My brother played baseball. Two of our kids played football, and my wife was a gymnast at Northwestern. And college sports has meant a lot, not just to our family, but to many of the families of the friends and people we know. And I've always thought that sports generally teaches lessons that you can apply everywhere. How to be a teammate, understand the grind. Success is about process, and how to win gracefully and lose with dignity. And I think sports is one of the great national treasures we have, and college sports in particular. Look no further than the last Olympic Games, and you can see what sports means to this country and what college sports does. And in particular with women's sports, somebody did a survey a few years ago, and 90% plus of the women who are in C-suites in the U.S. played sports in college. It's important.
The NCAA, one of the first things you did was you visited representatives of all, I think, 97 conferences in the country. Why today does the NCAA make sense as a single organization when you have such disparate members in terms of size, in terms of mission?
Yeah. I think what I would say about that, and part of the reason I wanted to talk to all 97 conferences was to make sure that I knew what was on their minds. And I said just about a year ago, shortly after I took the job, that we needed to rethink the way we were operating and organized, and to recognize the fact you have a lot of schools that spend $200 and $300 million on sports, and you have a lot of schools that spend 5 or 10. We are broken up into 3 divisions, 1, 2, and 3. But I don't think it's so much that there shouldn't be a national association. I think there's a lot of good reasons to have a national association, but I definitely think the national association needs to change. And we've been chasing that change agenda pretty much since I got there.
When you say that, what is the main thing you thought when you came in needed change?
I think the main thing was to figure out some way to create a rev share model for kids in schools in Division I. And the proposal that I made in December of last year. It was viewed as sort of heresy by a lot of people at the time. But it actually looks a lot like the settlement that we're currently in the process of working through the court system with some plaintiffs that have sued the NCAA.
That settlement, you've called you called NIL, which is name, image, likeness. You've called it, quote, dysfunctional. This settlement, which did just get tentatively approved by a judge a couple weeks ago or a week ago, do you think that makes it significantly more functional?
The big difference it does is right now most of the NIL stuff that takes place is either what people think of as traditional NIL, which is influencer branding, the kind of stuff that Olivia Dunn at LSU has been doing, or Caitlin Clark. But a lot of it is what people call synthetic NIL, which is the stuff that's done by collectives that are sort of
For those who don't know, what's a collective?
A collective is an organization that's typically made up of sponsors and supporters of a school sports program. They're not actually affiliated with the school, but they kind of sort of might be. And
they're basically bribing the kids to go play at the colleges.
And
correct?
They spend a lot of time just circling and chasing kids. And it's a very transactional activity. And their big mission is to get kids they think their school might want into the transfer portal. And as a result, they get a lot of kids into the transfer portal with a lot of stories that involve false promises, misrepresentations, and all sorts of other things. There's basically no rules governing these things. And a lot of those kids don't end up anywhere. Like a third of the kids that went into the transfer portal the last couple of years ended up nowhere. Because
when you say nowhere, so literally weren't in a school the following year?
Correct.
You said that settlement.
So the settlement
Yeah.
basically says NIL should be something that the schools negotiate and purchase with their student athletes.
And
that's the big change.
And under the terms of the settlement, a certain number of schools, kind of some of the biggest schools, are going to be able to directly pay athletes a little bit over, in aggregate, a little over $20 million per year. A couple questions about that. One, do you know right now, given Title IX, will that have to be split evenly between male and female athletes?
We don't know the answer to that. That was another thing about the collectives that was a problem. The collectives are not, because they're not actually part of a school, they don't have to comply with Title IX. There's a lawsuit in Oregon where that's being discussed. But if you look at where collectives spent their money, 95% of it went to men's sports and 90% of that went to football. And schools do have to comply with Title IX. What we have asked for and hope to get from the federal government, if the settlement gets approved, is guidance on how to think about Title IX in the context of the schools actually being the ones who are engaged in NIL.
Do you feel a little bit like your job, you're constantly putting your finger in a dam, because it seems like you solve or potentially solve one problem, and this settlement also deals with NIL for past athletes. It pays them a couple $2 billion for past. It feels like that you put your finger in the dam and then someone else sues. So for example, if you got that ruling from the federal government that said it has to be 50-50, you could almost see some booster somewhere suing you guys saying, no, I only want to give, the school should only be giving money to football. And traditionally, the NCAA loses almost all of its lawsuits about this stuff.
Yeah, the NCAA was like, whatever the number was, wins and 0 losses until 1984, which was in the big suit about college football.
What's your record since?
Not so good.
Like Patriots bad or just bad?
Not going there, okay? What I would say is that the risk of being sued is always there, okay? And what I have tried to say to our folks is we need to be in the business of recognizing and understanding opportunities to improve the way the system works for student athletes. And if we focus on that, if we get sued at some point, we get sued. But at least we'll be on what I would call the right side of the reasonable man test. We put in a post-eligibility insurance program. One of the first things we did after I got the job. So starting this past August, if you're a student athlete and you play a sport and you get hurt playing that sport, you get 2 years of coverage after you leave school if you're still in treatment. We core guarantees around scholarships. Going forward, if you get a scholarship at a D1 school, whether you play or not, you get to keep it. And you can have that scholarship for 10 years if it takes that long for you to complete your degree. We've been really aggressive about sports betting and about the conflicts associated with that and the abuse that's directed at student athletes because of that.
Can you talk to me about the abuse piece? What do you mean by that?
The amount of traffic that comes at kids on social media, and all we know about, what we've done is we do a lot of surveillance work around our championships, because earlier in my term, my first year, which would have been the spring of 23, there was a threat made on social media that was severe enough that
To a student?
To a team.
Oh, to a team.
We sent it to the local law enforcement folks, and they said, yeah, this is pretty bad. And they knew where it came from, and they said, we're going to put police protection around these kids for the rest of the time they're in the tournament, which obviously did wonders for their performance. But the point was, at that point, we were like, okay, we need to get surveillance on all of these major championships. And so we hired a firm, and that firm, before an event takes place, talks to the teams, talks to the schools that are hosting, and says, we would like the ability to actually track all of the social media that's directed at you, the players, the coaches, and the students. And we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of incredibly grim, vile, and disgusting things that get directed at what we see, which is just the public handle. I have no idea what showed up in the direct messages. I'm sure it was worse. But a lot of it is driven by betting.
Charlie, under the settlement, and I know it's tentative, but athletes, college athletes, are allowed to begin applying for payments. I think it was last Friday.
This is for the back damages.
For the back damages.
Right.
Did they start applying?
Yes.
Have you started? Give us any sense on what the first day looked like?
It's too early, but I mean, it's a $2.8 billion settlement paid out over 10 years. My guess is it'll be a lot of kids.
How do you view your authority? The NCAA is a really strange organization. I hate to say it this way. You almost seem a little bit
Talking
like
to a guy who came out of government and
I know,
healthcare,
but you
okay?
seem almost like a little bit, I hate to say it this way, and I have some, like a step parent. Like you have authority, but everyone also kind of knows it's a little bit tricky. Do you feel like you have real authority in this position, or do you feel you are more a guiding force than a regulatory force?
I say to people all the time that I have influence. For a variety of reasons. But the NCAA has 180 committees, and those committees have coaches and athletic directors and faculty advisors and conference commissioners and all sorts of other people and they are, for all intents.
Speaking of conferences, can you make a conference that says they have a number like 10 or 12 in it actually have that many teams? Can you do that? Is that your authority to make them at least have the math work? Or no, that's not, no, you can't.
But you're right in the sense that these committees are, in fact, the policy-making body for the organization. And what I have tried to do is to steer us in what I would describe as the best direction I believe we should be moving in. And we've had a reasonable amount of success in a reasonably short period of time, given that it is a committee-based system. And your argument about, do I have the kind of authority I had when I was governor or when I was CEO of Harvard Pilgrim? No. But it still matters.
Speaking of past government, you have said when it comes to kind of protecting students in terms of promises made, you've asked Congress to kind of intervene on this. You do come from government. What makes you think Congress is going to actually do anything, really about anything? Do you have any actual faith that will happen?
I would.
The U.S. Congress.
No, but this is interesting, the way these stories get communicated. When I was busy talking to those 97 conferences and listening to them and hearing what they had to say, I also went to Washington because I wanted to hear what people in Congress had to say. I did a lot more asking and listening when I was down there than, asking or demanding, right? And what I learned was they said, clean up your own house. Do something about post-eligibility injuries. Do something about kids getting run off campus on scholarships. Do something about figuring out a way to deal with this issue around NIL. So I feel like we've sort of done a lot of the things we got asked to do. I think if you were to say to me, if the settlement gets approved and we implement it and it works the way I hope it does and creates some real accountability and transparency and what I will call consumer protections for young people, then the ask from Congress would get relatively narrow, and it would be mostly about preemption. You now have 34 states that have different laws around how NIL works, and that's not just a problem for the NCAA, it's a problem for any conference that has more than 2 states in it, which is practically all of them. And then some sort of defining statement around this question about employment.
There's an argument that I keep hearing when it comes particularly to college football, that the way that the conferences are working or moving and the way teams are moving into different conferences, you're soon going to get basically one super conference, maybe 2 super conferences. They're going to be the ones who get all the media money, and then the other smaller D1 schools are going to be left without media money, and either will go away or that super conference should just leave the NCAA and should basically become a minor league. Do you feel in 10 years, is there still going to be the sort of college football that we know today where you've got dozens and dozens of D1 schools competing against each other for the same championship?
The hard part about, one of the really interesting things about being in government was I would get asked all the time to predict the future. And I pretty much never did.
Can I ask you a different
Let me just finish, because I knew I would be held accountable for what I predicted. Most of the people who predict whatever they want and realize no one's ever going to ask them 5 years later if it happened. What I would say about the future of college sports, and especially about football, is there's a huge part of community that comes with college sports and with college football, especially big-time college football. And I think one of the reasons why it stays inside the 4 walls of the schools is because it's such a big part of people's undergraduate and alumni experience. And do I think there's going to continue to be efforts made to find ways to enhance the value of that in the context of its TV ratings? I mean, those 2 games last weekend in the SEC both had more than 10 million viewers. I think the answer to that's yes. But when people start talking about mashing the whole thing together and sort of moving it outside the 4 walls of the school and and making, I mean, remember, most of the kids who play on those teams are not going to play professionally. They still need to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their life. And so walking completely away from the academic piece and from the sort of school piece, I would say I would not bet on that. I would certainly bet that it will continue to morph and change over time because people like it.
This is a deal-making summit. There has been a lot of talk about private equity starting to potentially get into college sports in different ways, possibly buying into conferences, buying media rights, creating advisories for athletic departments. Does private equity, from your perspective, have a role to play in college sports?
I think the answer is yes, but the big question in my mind would be you'd have to figure out, when I think about private equity, and as you noted, I worked at General Catalyst for a while, it's usually kind of a 3 to 5 year window that most people think about. Colleges make decisions in a much broader time frame than that. They're usually thinking, sometimes 10 to 20 years.
Yep.
And I think the question would be you'd have to figure out on your table of risk and resources how to make a private equity piece fit into a model that's not used to being designed to deliver returns in 3 years or 5 years.
Are you confident that schools are going to do that sober analysis as opposed to see dollar signs today and jump at it?
I think, one of the things I think the settlement will do, because of the 22% of the ticket revenue, media rights revenue, and sponsorship revenue, will be considered part of what the schools are spending on their student athletes NIL. I think schools are going to need to bring people into their athletic departments who are pretty good at figuring this sort of thing out. And a lot of them have said to me they've already started to do that, and they think they're going to have to get a lot more sophisticated about how they think about what they can do on the revenue side and the way they manage.
Does NCAA have a role in that, in overseeing it or regulating it?
I mean, our primary interests are still going to be with the kids. It's going to be about academic and athletic eligibility, graduation rates, progress to graduate, championship management, health and safety. I think we'll still worry a lot about those things. But I think the schools and the conferences will probably do more of that kind of thing.
NIL has obviously made a job like yours and the entire organization more complicated. Overall, are you glad it exists?
Yeah. No, I got asked this question when I got interviewed for the job. What do you think about, kids getting paid? And I said, well, I think it's a technology issue as much as anything else. And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, I grew up in a North Shore of Boston, and my kids started watching this guy who was writing silly songs on YouTube. And he was really good and really funny and very creative. And so we used to watch every week when he would put out his new songs. And eventually he got to like 100,000 followers, and then all of a sudden he had sponsors, right? The guy's name, by the way, was Bo Burnham, who became pretty famous. Yeah. But to me, what's really changed when it comes to fashion and music and influence and sort of all aspects of life is technology, and the internet made it really easy for very young people to build really big followings. And once you got to that place, you could not, in my mind, separate athletics from everything else.
You go to a lot of games that past NCAA presidents haven't gone to. In your, whatever it's been, kind of a year and a half, what's been your favorite collegiate sporting event to attend?
Okay, so I'm going to be political here and give you 2 or 3, because if I choose one, then a whole bunch, I went to the D2 spring championships last year in Orlando. The tennis championships, men and women's. Quality of the tennis was amazing, but the other thing that was really interesting is 58 countries were represented there. My wife and I went to the D3 football championship in Salem, Virginia. Final score 37-36. It was an absolute barn burner. And our 2 boys both played D3 football. So for us, that was kind of like...
Does it bother you, as head of the NCAA, that when schools change conferences and change to non-geographic conferences, right? These conferences all used to be very defined kind of in their regions, that it's one thing for the football players or the basketball players who are treated pretty well to have to get on a plane all the time, but that the tennis players, the gymnasts, et cetera, have to do the same?
I think the travel issue is... I would put that into sort of what I would call the TBD category. We have a lot of work to do to make sure we figure that out. And you're right, it's much easier for a football team that plays 5 away games and they're either on Friday night or Saturday night to do this. It's much harder for a basketball team, a hockey team, a field hockey team, a softball team to do this in the context of the number of games they play. And some of the stuff schools and conferences have been talking about to manage some of those travel things, I think will play out over the next couple of years.
I can't get out of here. We have 30 seconds left without one political question, given your background. You have said that over the last 2 presidential elections, you left the presidential field blank. Are you going to leave it blank again in 2 weeks from today?
You know, I got asked this question when I gave a talk to a business group about a week ago, and I said, you know, I'm the NCAA president. I don't talk about that stuff now. I talk about sports, and I'm happy to talk about that.
I'm not asking for an endorsement. I'm simply saying you're going to put a name down. That name might be Mickey Mouse, but are you going to put a name in that box?
We'll see.
We'll see. Charlie Baker.
I don't have to answer that question.
You don't have to. You should. Charlie, thank you.
Okay, Dan. Should ask you what you're going to